Hello! Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cine-Lit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cine-Lit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cine-Lit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to Cine-Lit. Today we are getting nasty, video nasties that is, to coincide with the release of Prano Bailey-Bond's Censor, a film out in August, about a film Censor set during the hysteria and moral panic over video certification in the 1980s, our era more colloquially known as the Video Nasties era. I am your host, Adam Marsh, and I am joined by Cine-Lit's resident expert, Darrell Buxton. How are you, Darrell?
Very well, thanks, Adam. Looking forward to talking about a familiar old subject, but hopefully putting a few new spins on it.
To help us explore this time period in British film, we are delighted to welcome back to the podcast John Martin.
Hello.
John joined us for our episode on Dario Argento last year, where we waxed lyrical about the brilliance of Argento and also the not-so-brilliant bits of Argento's career. Today we are calling upon his history with the Video Nasties as the author of the 1999 book Seduction of the Gullible. Hello, John. Welcome back to Cine-Lit.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Darrell and I have been writing about this stuff for yonks now, and it never goes away. But we're particularly interested today in maybe getting the perspective of somebody from a younger generation, one of those people who was a child being corrupted, and their mum and dad were letting them watch Video Nasties, and they were going into the kitchen and reaching for the carving knife. People such as yourself, Adam.
Hello.
Hello.
I am that 6-year-old. Yes. I wasn't carving people up with a kitchen knife though. So Video Nasties, as Darrell said, a well-trod subject, maybe not so much to the listeners of this podcast, but an era in British film, I was going to say cinema, but it wasn't really cinema, it was British home video, which was a brand new thing at the time.
Cinema came into it in some regards because there was kerfuffle about things that had actually been shown in the cinema, and the very same thing on videotape was being prosecuted as some sort of outre outrage, and the whole thing is so clouded, and hopefully, maybe we'll shine some light on that as we go along.
Cool. Okay, well, there you go. I mean, why? Seriously, but why do we have this whole thing? Because it seems like, I think we've talked about this before off air, but like it feels like a massive hoo-ha over nothing nowadays when you can go on the internet and see all manner of things.
In a word, politics.
And in 2 words, moral panic.
Yeah. Now, it goes back to the Thatcher government being elected in 1979 and immediately having to deal with the problem of mass unemployment in Britain, which they'd sort of pretended they could do something about in the 79 election campaign, and clearly had no intention of doing anything about. And the situation got worse and worse and worse. So immediately you had hypocrisy where they put up the famous Labour isn't working posters during that election campaign, complaining that there were over 1 million people unemployed. Now, within a few years of the election, there were 3 or 4 million unemployed, and that was the official figure that was being reported. And riots were breaking out. People were protesting about the sort of early days of the government. Once it sort of became clear what the policies were going to be, and it seems that the Conservative Party needed to come up with scapegoats or needed to come up with sort of distractions or manoeuvres by which they could keep public support on their side. And there were several, but the campaign against video nasties was one of them, and they were a sort of easy target. Now, what's fascinating to me about this, and an issue that isn't discussed often enough, is the fact that Thatcherism seemed all about things like popular ideas like home ownership, and in particular, this idea that you can start your own business. With Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, you can start your own business. And a lot of people did. And funnily enough, a lot of people started up their own little corner shop video emporiums, renting the latest videotapes. In conjunction with that, you'd got the major Hollywood studios very, very wary of home video. Warner Brothers, for instance, didn't release many titles early on. They really took their time over it. And so there was a gap in the market. And of course, when there's a gap in the market, what do you get? Del Boy. Mm-hmm. You know, you get fly-by-night entrepreneurs working out of the back of a van or something, you know, and setting up their own little video labels, getting hold of whatever films they can and putting them out onto the market. So suddenly, not only have we got this new technology coming straight into your home, you've got this big clunky video recorder under your TV. You can put tapes into it and you can choose what you want to watch. But your choice seems to be fairly limited. You can't choose to watch the new Clint Eastwood film. You've got a choice of whether you want to watch this Italian horror movie or this Spanish horror movie, because that's sort of all there was out in the marketplace, it seems. So, yeah, we've got this interesting setup where on one hand, the government's trying to encourage small businesses, and on the other, they're taking away the livelihood from those businesses by suppressing the very product that they're trying to shift.
They often say that the past is a different country sort of thing. And it's like everything you're saying there feels really familiar, but to a whole generation, the idea of not being able to see a film immediately is completely alien to them. I mean, when I was growing up, when I hit my early 20s, late teens, DVD was really coming in. I was working in a video show when that came in. And I remember literally the boss was there saying, it'll never take on. I'm like, you are kidding me. You are kidding me. Made purely from just a case of like, you can fit twice as many films on your shelf. Now we don't even have shelves. You know, you can literally have digital spaces where you can keep all your films. So you can pretty much see whatever you want, whenever you want. And just that very concept was so far away from 1979, 80 sort of period when you were waiting 5-6 years for films.
Only 40 years ago, yeah. Astonishing, really.
Yeah, I mean, for some of us, we've been growing up reading about in fanzines and American magazines about these obscure, you know, a blood feast about all sorts of stuff and thinking, oh God, if only I could see that. I'll never get to see that. And then suddenly, I mean, I'm not so far along the line that I prefer streaming stuff. I do like physical artifacts, but, and again, I would keep my DVDs and my Blu-rays are so much better than VHS. I so rarely watch VHS these days, if ever, but nothing will ever compare with the thrill of going into a VHS shop in the early days of it and just seeing all this stuff. There was one I went into where they had the sleeves sort of reproduced all over the wall, and they directed you to the place in the bins that they were. And seeing this stuff, oh my God, there's Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue, there's, you know, the blood-spattered bride, stuff you'd been reading and salivating about for years and you never thought you'd see it. Suddenly there it was. Darrell mentioned Del Boy, and it made me think of Des Boy. There was this guy, Des Dolan, who ran Go Video, which is one of the more notorious labels, and the stuff they used to put out is terrible. A Go blank tape that they used ran an hour and a half, so if a film ran longer than that, they just cut out 10 minutes. The screen dimensions, the actual framing, everything was awful. But Des was the man who famously put a copy of his own release of Cannibal Holocaust in the mail to Mary Whitehouse and said, "God blimey, Mary, have you seen this? It's awful." And that was a real sort of stunt that backfired disastrously, because that is seen as one of the main things that got the video nasty bandwagon rolling.
Yeah. Now, to come back on your point about video shops for a moment, John, I've never experienced anything in my life quite like the first time I walked into a video rental store.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about Blockbuster and things here. In the early days, 1980, 81, you'd go into these places, they were sort of tucked away down alleyways and things, and they'd have about 30 tapes, and a guy's sort of smoking a fag behind the counter. But you can guarantee that of those 30 tapes, and there were sort of gaps, the tapes were sort of socially distant, they were so few that there were sort of gaps on the walls, and they had like a rack of shelves that they bought from some other shop that had just closed down somewhere, But you can guarantee that on there were Dez's Go videotapes would be there, and things like the early Vipco tapes and things. And so you'd have Zombie Flesh Eaters, which again had already been released to UK cinemas in a slightly cut version. But the video box trumpeting and proclaiming the fact that this was a longer uncut version, strong uncut version. Yeah. And of course that was the one with that sticker on the front was the one that sort of 16-year-old me headed straight for, and it was magic. We'd never seen shops like this. A shop where you went in, you didn't buy anything. This was new to us. You went in, you browsed through the sort of 24 tapes on the shelves. You usually grabbed the one with the most lurid and interesting looking cover, took that to the counter, not knowing much about what you were sort of paying your £1 or £2 over for. And then you took that home for 3 nights, watched it 10 times, usually with your mum and dad or your granny in the same room. I recall fondly a Sunday afternoon where our entire family, me, my 2 younger brothers, and my mum and dad all sat down and watched a film called Invasion of the Blood Farms.
Yes.
The idea that my mum has seen that still tickles me to this day, But yeah, it was different. It was new, and this was something different on the high street. We'd never seen anything like it before. The problem soon started, as we know, and it's been well documented elsewhere. It really does come down to politics and the government needing to sort of focus the public's attention away from basically the unemployment situation and other sort of areas where their policy was either clearly failing or was so poorly etched anyway that there wasn't a policy. So there were various sort of social and domestic and workplace issues that were just not being addressed by the government. And rather than address them, it was, what else can we look at? How can we sort of divert attention away from that? And in conjunction with the craze for video, which took off in the UK, unlike any other country, the UK went for video in a big way, whereas
precisely because the British public had been deprived of this sort of stuff for so many decades by the BBFC.
Yes, yeah, and
it was like the floodgates opening.
Exactly. And so that was a natural target.
Sorry, as someone who is less familiar with this well-trodden ground, it's like the BBFC weren't classifying videos at this period. No. So basically, they were unclassified. Wild West.
It was the Wild West.
Yes, yeah.
So everything was coming out, and it could be like Bambi, or it could be Bambi gets chopped up by knives or whatever.
And this is why you got your dodgy entrepreneurs coming in, because they knew a person who could get hold of this stuff and import these films over from Europe. And as we've said, the major studios, your big American studios, saw video as the enemy initially. They didn't want to get involved in it. So while Burt Reynolds and Clint Eastwood films were huge at the box office, the studios were sitting on them and not allowing them out for home viewing. And so again, there was a gap there that the sort of more dodgy-minded businessman could suddenly come in from underneath and say, right, I'll take that slice of the market. If Warner Brothers don't want it, I'll have it, and they made a fortune.
So there's a name that looms large over this whole period that probably younger generations, thankfully, don't really know, and that's Mary Whitehouse. Now, I didn't know much about Mary Whitehouse. I only know her from the various different comedy shows that I used to watch and being ridiculed for being hysterical over ridiculous things. But she was a real threat in this respect. She was definitely.
She had power, genuinely. She had the ear of the government. And for one individual running a sort of fairly sort of underground, not particularly well supported organisation.
She was disproportionately heard, wasn't she?
It was disproportionate power, yeah.
Okay, so it's like a Nigel Farage thing,
Very much, very much.
She just wanted to turn the clock back to the famous five, and anything over and above that was a serious threat to our way of life.
And you imagine that if she'd actually read a famous five novel, she'd have probably found something to object to.
Well, I find stuff to object to in a famous five. There's a pecking order in the famous five: the boys, the dog, the girls. That's literally the pecking order. So I don't think it's a good model to build this future society.
I think you're coming at that from a different direction to the one Mary Whitehouse would have done. She'd have been okay with that, but they were curious times and. As we're seeing at the moment, in strange times, strange figures appear out of the ether.
But she was conniving very actively with politicians and press barons to whip up and distort evidence and promulgate fantasies and fiction about what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like she managed to arrive at the front of a wave that she created herself in some ways. I guess from my point of view, looking at it, I started to see these films. I say I was 6 years old in the midst of this thing. I remember going to video shops like you were, Darrell. I remember the first dedicated video shop open up, because previous to that it was like the corner shop that had a wall of videos and that was it, and then you go in there and rent the same video each week over and over again as a kid, because there was like 2 kids films on there. The rest were these vile Italian and Spanish horror movies. But I remember the first video shop opening up, and I distinctly remember it because me and my brother cried so much that we couldn't rent Empire Strikes Back that the guy let us have 2 videos in our first week. Yeah. God bless that man.
Well, he's trying to hook his customers. He's thinking at that time that videos are going to be around for the next 100 years, and he wants to make sure that you come into his shop every week.
In a few weeks, I'll be renting them. Debbie does Dallas.
Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, this thing about age is interesting, and because as John's mentioned, the way the press reported this at the time was to sort of target the idea that children were watching these things within the household. Initially, it was reported as though working man from Barnsley or wherever, and this was a big thing as well. It became a sort of class thing, didn't it? The way it was reported in the press was sort of, working people can get hold of these terrible movies and take them home, and they can watch them in front of their children, as though this was a sort of coordinated plan. And there are two things I want to say about the sort of junior viewers of Video Nasties and of videos in total from that early 80s era. One is that you're now finding that as documentaries are being made about this era, and as books are still being written and articles are coming out, more and more people are sort of doing lectures and things on them. You do find that people that are sort of your age, Adam, or maybe slightly younger, are coming out and trying to sort of latch on to this and trying to sort of say that they were part of it. You've talked about watching kids' films when you were 6, but there are people out there who say, oh yeah, my mum and dad or my uncle and auntie let me watch Video Nasties in 1982 or 83 or whatever.
And they went to see the Sex Pistols at the
they did, yes, yeah, aged 6, yeah. And then formed the band when they came out. So yeah, you do get this little layer I'm going to pretend that I was there because I was alive and it was sort of happening. And you weren't, you know, I'm sure none of us can remember much about what we were doing when we were 6 or 7. Secondly, and sort of tied in with that, is a very good book came out in 1984, edited by Martin Barker, just called The Video Nasties. Barker and his team attempted to they were one of the first set of people to try and dismantle and challenge the government and establishment thinking on all this. And one thing that Barker reports in the book is a survey that was done among school children to find out whether they'd seen a video nasty, so that the press could then report the percentage figures, you know, and outrage their readers by saying 70% of children under 6 have seen a video nasty. The way this was done was they gave kids in various schools lists of all the banned films and asked them to tick off which ones they'd seen. And of course, a lot of kids said, oh yeah, I've seen Cannibal Holocaust, I've seen Evil Dead, you know, and so on. And they were then asked to describe the plots and came up with their own wild inventions. And of course, what happened is the figures got reported just based on the tick box. It was, 60% of kids have seen House by the Cemetery or The Beyond or Cannibal Ferox or whatever. What wasn't reported was that similar surveys were done to sort of counter this information, and the people designing the survey actually put ringers onto the list. They invented film titles. And of course, a lot of the kids said that they'd seen the invented titles as well, which made a mockery of the whole thing, destroyed all of this so-called evidence. And yet the press, of course, picked up on the bits of that fitted their agenda. So even today, it's sort of gone down in accepted history that lots of children were watching video nasties, and that was actually far from the truth.
And they've all got vivid memories of seeing Sex with the Headless Corpse of the Virgin Astronaut. Exactly. Or Bambi Goes Crazy, 8 Bonkers with his drill and sex, that kind of stuff. A couple of young ones references there. Yeah, but I find that whole fascinating because, like, now, obviously, there's starting to feel like there's concerns about internet viewing and things like that, and the way that the BBFC currently don't have any say over internet videos. I don't know how they're going to be able to recall to ever get involved like such a worldwide thing, but it feels like some of those concerns are resurfacing over the last 5-10 years with it, and obviously it goes back to history as well. This is not a new thing. Have the Video Nasties era opened up the floodgates? And because, like, a couple of battles were lost early on, but ultimately the war was won against this. Have we opened up the floodgates, and maybe that's not a good thing?
Well, it's political again, Adam. The way the establishment deals with this sort of thing is, and you've used the terms there, battle and war, you know, and that's what the video thing was like. In this instance, the establishment, the Conservative government, Mrs. Whitehouse, the protesters, the British press, won a few battles, and they got a few films prosecuted, and they got a few films cut, they got a few films suppressed. One issue we can go on to talk about later is individuals actually being targeted, collectors being targeted, and actually fined or imprisoned, which is outrageous, and that may be something that people aren't aware of. But a few battles were won by the establishment. Ultimately, they lost the war. And what happens when the establishment loses a conflict like that? They come up with another way of winning it, and the way they do that is to monetize it and see how, okay, if we've got to have films about people having all their limbs chopped off and being decapitated, how can we make money out of this? How can we stop Des Dolan and Del Boy and these dodgy back of the van people making black market profits on this when we could actually making big money on it? So it's all brought under the wing of the establishment, and it's monetized and profitized. This, I'm sure, will happen eventually with online services. In some respects, it already is. You know, with linked in with directly linked in with films and so on. You're already seeing that with streaming services. who are seemingly able to make, produce and broadcast content, a lot of which is influenced by the video nasty era. Mainstream series like Walking Dead, Game of Thrones and so on, water cooler TV that is beamed out as mainstream television. I remember the ex-editor of Fangoria, Chris Alexander, writing a column about Walking Dead in Fangoria magazine some years ago, and sort of saying in astonishment, you know, what's next? A cannibal TV series, you know, an Italian cannibal type show, you know. And I'm sure if there hasn't already been one, there probably will. I'm sure that's on someone's word processor or in the pipeline at this very moment. And it's extraordinary to people of our age to see this stuff going mainstream. But the reason that's happening is that's the way that the establishment actually takes control over all of this. And that's happening to sort of visual entertainment online. And I'm sure that will happen to other forms of internet broadcasting and internet content in due course. One area where I've been very, very surprised that there hasn't really been much of a clampdown, and it's something that people like me and John are maybe a bit too old to sort of know much about, but it's huge. It's the biggest thing in entertainment, in home entertainment, I think at the moment, is the video game, the whole gaming world. Why has that not been targeted in the way that conventional film and television entertainment has been?
Well, like Darrell, I haven't particularly gotten into that leisure activity, but and maybe here I'm going to promulgate again myths of the sort that I, criticised during the Video Nasties era. I am more or less reliably told that there's an element of Grand Theft Auto where you can stop off to have sex with a prostitute, and if you don't fancy paying her, you can shoot her before you resume your car chasing antics. And again, maybe I've been misinformed, but if so, what?
I mean, I'm no expert on the world of gaming, but Grand Theft Auto is a certificated game.
Yeah.
It has gone through the BBFC. It has been classified as an 18 certificate, so anyone under the age of 18 shouldn't be playing those games.
So there's classification in place there.
There is classification in place. I mean, only in the last, I'd say 20 years. I mean, the late 90s. I remember working at Blockbuster and there being certificates on the games.
Yeah. Now we actually fought for classification of the video nasties. Our generation wasn't against classification of cinema, but what
we're old enough to see them and we want to see them.
Yes, yeah. What we were putting forward was the idea of if you must have control over this, if somebody must control what we see, please do, but allow an adult audience to see uncut adult fare, and if you're going to impose restrictions, don't impose it on grown-ups, basically. I get the sense that there's a little bit more leeway and things are a bit more lenient in the gaming world. There's no sort of Director of Public Prosecution's list of banned titles, which is what we had in the mid-80s, for instance.
No, but I think because of the fight that was for video nasties in the 80s, when the games that were aimed at adults started coming through in the 90s, you like Grand Theft Autos and your bigger games, half the battle was already won. For that kind of we don't censor thing, the idea of censoring stuff for the sake of protecting the moral integrity of Britain. That had kind of already been won in some ways. So a lot of they weren't starting from the same starting ground as the video nasties were. And also, there was a lot more money involved in those games at the period. It wasn't like your little out of the back of those days are gone. That was the 80s gaming boom. The 80s gaming boom was a guy in his bedroom designing a game and then flogging it the next week. By the time the 90s come around, you had companies that were big, major companies that were putting out games. And they were the Warner Brothers. They were the Paramount of that period.
Derby, of course, knows all about that because we're the home of Tomb Raider. So,
exactly, yeah. Lara Croft was born not that far away from here. And they were a small company, but their small company still had a whole bunch of people employed by them. They weren't out of the back of a lorry, one man in his bedroom thing. They were a company who quickly got bought out by another company on the back of the success of Tomb Raider. So I think that starting ground was a different starting ground, and the amount of money that these things were making kind of protected them from major prosecution for many years. I mean, it did come down eventually because parents didn't know where to start. They were like, I think in a different way to get to films. People know they watch a film and go, okay, that film is not suitable for my 9-year-old. Whereas with games, no parent is playing 70 hours of Grand Theft Auto to discover whether you can hire a prostitute and then shoot them. No one's doing that. Yeah,
that's the difference there. At least Jess Franco cannibal films are sort of 85 minutes long. So
sometimes they seem a lot longer.
Yeah, they do indeed.
God, yes.
They do indeed. Now, John, I wonder if, like me, you take a lot of satisfaction in what Adam is saying there, in this notion that our victory that we sort of campaigned for amongst other people, amongst a generation of fans of this sort of extreme cinema, we ultimately won that war. And Adam was suggesting there that then set a new benchmark that gaming companies and anyone else coming up with any sort of new platform in entertainment has now suddenly had this new starting point to work from that we'd sort of set in place. We'd said you can have entertainment at a certain level of extremity and with a certain level of content in, and there's nothing that you can do about that, because if you do, we will rise up and challenge that. I'm very satisfied by what Adam's saying there about how it seems to me you're suggesting that we'd sort of set this new sort of level. How do you feel about that?
Well, it'd be interesting to think that we achieved something over and above the pittance we've earned from writing about these things over the years. But we do congratulate ourselves on winning the war.
Another film that was looked at by the Director of Public Prosecution and ended up on video nasty lists, and to my knowledge has never been released in Britain, was a film called Fight for Your Life, which was sort of fairly, it's a low budget but fairly mainstream American sort of home invasion thriller from the late 70s, but pits white criminals against a black family, and does so in a way where it's a violent film, but maybe no more violent than a lot of stuff that you were seeing in the cinema at the time. But it's an interesting title to include in the Video Nasties discussion, because its main sort of its main sort of threat and its main sort of problematic issue is in terms of language. It's in terms of the film's dialogue. It's nothing to do with the visuals. It's what the characters say to each other.
And it's the old Alf Garner thing again. You are meant watching Till Death Us Do Part and Fight for Your Life. You are meant to be watching it and despising the person who's spouting the racist garbage. But from a censorious point of view, it's, will the working classes understand that that's the bad stuff, and they're supposed to be against that? They might take it as gospel, Yeah. So it's those sort of perceptions.
That kind of classification thing that's still there now. I mean, maybe not now, but definitely when I first started working in cinemas around about 2000. In those early 2000s, there was quite a lot of sexually explicit films being released into art house cinemas. Yeah. Things like Romance, things like Intimacy with Kerry Fox and things like that.
And stuff like I Know Corrida was being
I Know Corida was re-released. Yeah. So things that are quite extreme, quite high-end sex films, for want of obviously a lot more going on in those movies. Well, they were all released.
This was the legacy of James Furman, of course.
It was just like these films were being released, and you kind of got the feeling that because they were art house cinema and because that they were only being played in predominantly middle class attended cinemas up and down the country, they kind of got a pass in some ways that maybe something like something a bit more mainstream wouldn't have done. And because can the working classes really manage to understand these films for what they are without a degree?
There's very much a class issue here, and in all forms of this type of argument. It goes back again to Lady Chatterley's Lover, doesn't it?
Would you allow your servants to read something like this?
Yeah. and I mean, things were being reported in newspapers and in articles in the 80s. That you'd read lines like, should we expose a factory worker in Bradford to this sort of thing? And you were actually getting this sort of stuff in newspaper articles. So there was this perception that it's all right if you want to watch it at the Everyman Cinema in London, and if you paid your membership to go to an art house cinema, you're allowed to watch this stuff. If you want to take it home and watch it in front of you, while you're eating your beans on toast and with your kids playing around you, that's a no-no. So there was very much sort of class thing going on there. But it was interesting that the relaxation in sexual imagery, which occurred in the year 2000, we can pinpoint it, because that's the year that James Furman retired from his long-held position at the BBFC. Now, if we had another sort of hate figure alongside Mrs. Whitehouse during this whole sort of 80s period, it was Mr. Furman.
And then was it into the 90s? We got David Alton.
David Alton, MP,
he was another
yes.
one in the Hall of Fame, yeah.
Well, David Alton, this was, again, an exhibition of how the video nasties thing really all played out, strangely enough, in the Orwell year of 1984. But the whole David Alton thing showed that it hadn't gone away, that it could sort of be revived at any time. If it was needed as an excuse, they could pull it out of the back pocket.
Well, there was this particularly unfortunate case up in Liverpool of this kid, Jamie Bulger, who was murdered by some of the children, and the judge said he couldn't work out why the children would be in such a frame of mind. Maybe they watched violent videos. And the sort of red tops managed to turn this into, yes, they watched Child's Play 3, and that's where it all came from. There's absolutely no evidence for this. Alton, my particular favourite memory of Alton was when he would repeatedly spout the police were shocked by the connections they found between the murder case and the film Child's Play 3. And if you go back and look at the reporting of the crime, the police repeatedly said this has absolutely nothing to do with videos, but Alton repeatedly said that they believed it was connected. And of course, nobody in the media ever challenges this stuff. It just goes into the folklore, But he was a particularly odious individual. He made a name for himself, a platform. He was eventually elevated to the House of Lords, so he did all right for himself.
He did, as they all do. There are figures like Graham Bright who sort of went through the same process. Politician with an agenda. Picks up on the whole video thing and is given various gongs and titles afterwards, But an interesting thing came out of in the wake of the whole Alton and James Bulger business. There was new legislation suggested, and I don't know how far it got in Parliament, but I'm sure there were debates about this, because a big thing, even as late as the early 90s, a big thing was that you'd go to Woolworths, you'd buy a pack of blank VHS tapes, you'd go home, put them in your video recorder, and you'd tape programmes and films off the TV. One of the points of discussion was that there was actually a threat at one point that legislation was going to be brought into the UK that said that if you record anything off your television, you can only keep it for 28 days in your own home, and you must then wipe the tape. Now, anyone younger than us listening to that is going to be there. You simply won't believe what I'm saying, will you? I mean, that's a ridiculous sort of idea and was never, ever going to hold water. But
my dad had the entirety of the Live Aid concert on video, and he wasn't wiping that for nobody.
This brings up a rather more sinister and more genuine sort of issue, though, which was actually happening a few years before that, in the sort of mid to late 80s. In the wake of the whole Video Nasties furore and the Director of Public Prosecution drawing up an official list of banned titles, which gave John a handy checklist for your book, didn't it? You know, they were.
And I still missed a few.
But in the wake of all that, obviously new legislation had to come in, and the British Board of Film Classification, or censors, whichever one you want to, whichever term they were using at the time, were given new powers. They had to now sort of classify videos as well as cinema films. So to address what you were talking about earlier, Adam. Also, police raids began around the country. And there were a lot of people, myself and John included, who'd amassed huge collections of videotapes, often through the pages of various British fanzines, which was the sort of network. Again, there's no internet or anything at this point, you know. We're doing everything, sort of sending letters through the post to each other and sending padded envelopes through the post, or sending a tenner in an envelope through the post and getting back 2 videotapes, you know, and finding out who's got what through the back pages of a sort of rather poorly produced and poorly typed horror fanzine, you know. And again, me and John were heavily involved in that whole scene too. This never happened to me, and I don't know about yourself, John. Maybe you can tell us in a moment, but I think we both know friends and certain individuals who were treated effectively like drug criminals.
Pariahs.
Yeah. The police would raid houses, the traditional police battering your door down at 6 a.m. in the morning, coming in, looking through your video collection and taking half of it away with them, and then you'd get a fine. In some cases, you might even go to prison. Case in point, a friend of mine who still lives locally, friend who lives in mid-Derbyshire, wasn't arrested, wasn't fined or anything, but tried to import a video copy of Stuart Gordon's film Reanimator from America through the post. And it was a film that, again, had been released in UK cinemas in a slightly cut version. It had had great reviews. It had been acclaimed by fans, but it had been acclaimed by many critics too. It was seen as being a very exciting sort of new step forward for the horror movie. And my mate tried to order a copy from the States, and all he received instead was a letter from the UK Customs Office saying, we've received this package, we've opened it up and we've played this tape and we found it's on a list of prohibited material. And he was told that he could actually I think he was told something like he could go down and collect the package in person, or go down and talk to them about why he thought he should be allowed to receive this parcel or something. But I think that was, you know, anyone receiving a sort of message like that stayed well clear. And so that was an example that I know of, a direct friend of mine, you know. But we were hearing stories of people actually getting big fines or doing prison time, and for owning videos that you can now go into HMV and buy with a 15 certificate, you know. And again, it's absolutely unbelievable. And the point a lot of people made when they were raided was you did hear stories of people pointing out to the police that, yeah, okay, I've got films that are on the banned list in my collection. I've got Cannibal Holocaust, and I've got all of these sort of outrageous zombie films and so on. But if you look through my whole collection, I've got films dating back from the 1890s in there. I'm a horror film fan. I'm a horror historian. And I love everything from the silent era through the 30s and 40s, through the science fiction films, through the Hammer films, and I'm only collecting these films because I see them as part of a history, and that, of course, cut no ice whatsoever with the authorities, even though in most cases it was absolutely true.
My favourite raid story is that there was a raid in Essex at the height of this panic, and I don't know if Darrell realises where this one is leading, but there was a Eurasian police officer that was there, a lady officer, and the her colleagues were going through this guy's collection going, oh my God, Deep River Savages, this is awful. Eaten Alive, The Last Survivor, cannibalism, real cannibalism, because that was the line that was being pushed in the media at the time, that people were really being eaten in cannibal films. Anyway, this uncomfortable young WPC was going, yeah, that's shocking, because she was in fact Mimi Lai. And she had starred in all of the movies I just mentioned and subsequently became a policewoman. But on a less amusing note, the sort of levels of hysteria that we're talking about were just ramped up by just such astonishing comments, like the aforementioned Graham Bright. I couldn't move on without mentioning this, the Graham Bright MP, who had his name put to the allegedly private members bill that became the Video Recording Act. It was all actually really closely managed by Leon Britton and co. But anyway, he was quoted as saying that video nasties had a bad effect on young minds, but also they had a very detrimental effect on dogs. And if anything could illustrate to a younger generation who are historically removed from that just how ludicrous the whole thing was. And if you get the Ban the Sadist videos, I think, which is the documentary by...
I think it's on Jake West's.
It's on Jake's
one of the two that Jake
and
with Mark
Mark's.
Morris, yes.
Anyway, that is freely available, and you'll see the footage on there, called from the news, of Graham Bright saying that video nasties had a very bad effect on dogs. I think there's possibly also the stuff on there in which George Eastman in heavy makeup is sort of pretending to eat a skinned rabbit, which is supposed to be a fetus, and this played on news at 10 as a clip from a snuff movie.
Yeah, I recall seeing that very news broadcast.
My God,
thinking,
who would ever forget
that? Yeah.
But those were the times we were living through, and it's quite appalling and astonishing.
I think Graham's dog just was disappointed that Straw Dogs had a distinct lack of dogs in it.
But the other thing that came from this, of course, was a real community emerged. Because this stuff was forbidden fruit, obviously people wanted to see it. And I, Darrell, to a certain extent yourself, I know, yeah, I've sat down and watched the stuff on this list because it was on the prescribed list. My God, a huge proportion of it is stuff that you wouldn't show to your worst enemies, you know. Really, really poor stuff. Although, interestingly enough, a lot of the stuff that I dismiss as poor stuff and oh my God, never want to watch that again. There are quite serious books these days being written, like Stephen Thrower with his American Nightmare, and all sorts of humble auteurs are being talked of in quite lofty terms.
Case in point, one film in your book, Seduction of the Gullible, which I happen to have a copy of.
You're going for Blood Rights,
is Blood Rights, which is a film better known as The Ghastly Ones, if it's known at all. And it's one of only two video nasties. I think it's one of only two that actually date from the 1960s. And again, it's outrageous that films as old as that were being included on this list. This is a film from 1969, and John dismisses it in about 10 lines in his book. You can hardly find anything to say about it.
You can sense me trying to keep my eyes open watching it.
Yeah, you finish up by saying, I don't know what else to say about Blood Rights, except that I hope and pray I never again have to sit through anything quite so mind-numbingly bad. Now, that's fair comment to an extent.
I did recently rewatch it as part of the Severin box.
Yeah, because Severin, the label that's run by
David Gregory,
our pals from Nottingham, David Gregory and Carl Daft, who now David's now sort of relocated to America, where he sort of beams all this stuff out from. They've recently put together a box set based on the work of the director of The Ghastly Ones, or Blood Rights as it was known over here, Andy Milligan. Now, Andy Milligan has become notorious over the decades as the world's worst filmmaker, or, you know, somebody who doesn't know which way to hold or point a camera. And there's something in that, but this box set and books about Milligan and analysis of his work has taken a new turn. He's now been seen as very much in tandem with the likes of John Waters, as a sort of outsider artist, working with the stock company, working with particular themes in his movies. And they are good or bad. At least they're now being sort of addressed and taken seriously and given serious film criticism. And if you told us that watching this film 38, 39 years ago, I simply don't know how we would have reacted.
Well, when I began writing film criticism, the sort of the pantheon was occupied by people like Terence Fisher, Roger Corman, Val Newton, and so on. But now a lot of the Bava is, if anything, his stock has increased. But the other guys have kind of dwindled in relation to the way that people like Al Adamson and Andy Milligan are now revered.
Well, there've been box sets in the past 6 months for William Graffet and Bill Rebane. So we're sort of reaching the bottom of the barrel there on these sort of 1960s and 70s sort of regional filmmakers whose films are not in some cases. I think they're worthy of this reanalysis. In others, they really are bottom of the barrel, but that doesn't stop the boutique Blu-ray labels from repackaging their stuff and presenting it in a way that says, look, this is this filmmaker's body of work. Buy it and take it or leave it.
I still find Milligan's films a hard watch. He has become, in my mind, something more like William Burroughs in that his life is more interesting, and
that's fair comment. Although I must say, watching his films in a batch, as I did when the box set came out, I've always liked his stuff perhaps more than I should, and I'm now a confirmed and committed fan. I now regard him. I now sort of see him in the same sort of ballpark as John Waters, or one of these, even an Andy Warhol. I think he's got that sort of thing going on, and maybe it's the sort of repetition of use of actors and that sort of stock company idea, which is something I always take to. I love that in artists, But it's interesting that, as you say, people like Stephen Thrower are now. I think Stephen's always taken these artists seriously. He was the one person from that fanzine generation who would go out to bat for these guys, and he's now doing it more and more, and as you say, doing it in now glossy coffee table books.
And he has come from that fanzine thing. I mean, slightly later than ourselves, marginally so, but he's taken it to another level, and it's interesting that. Again, the fact that the fanzine thing and the trading thing all emerged because this stuff was forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
With regards to sort of like the elevation of potentially low art to high art, I think maybe that's how one of the side effects of this video Nasties, by creating a list of films that are deemed wrong, bad, terrible, etc. And you've got people like Argento on that list, you've got people like Bava on that list. You automatically get, well, no, these people are not, and they write about these people because they are being classified unfairly. And then you get to the point where we've already elevated Argento, we've already elevated Bava, we're working on Jess Franco, and there's all these other directors that we work there, and you get to that bottom of the barrel where you're still looking for what is there must be something here.
I think
because it's alongside Argento.
Yeah, I think so. I think We've reached that point, I think, as writers and analysts and critics, where you do exactly that. You look for the nuggets in a film like Frozen Scream, which is a complete write-off. There's nothing good about that. But yeah, you do sit down and watch it, or Mardi Gras Massacre or something like that. And the films are now being made available on Blu-ray, so you are able to see them in their sort of correct ratios and presented. I say presented as the directors intended. I'm not sure that's an appropriate phrase here. I'm not sure these directors gave a damn about how their films are presented, but they're being presented at least without the image being cropped as they often were on VHS tapes. I think Stephen Thrower reported on a Blu-ray recently that Jess Franco's film The Demons, Les Demons, on its VHS release in Britain, there are points in that film where we're actually only looking at 30% of the frame. And that's outrageous. That is outrageous. And
but that was Des Dolan again, wasn't it?
It was, and he didn't give a damn, did he? So yeah, at least now we're able to judge these films properly, and it doesn't necessarily make them any better in every case. But I think you're absolutely right, Adam, in saying that this whole thing about the Director of Public Prosecution making up these lists. And there are sort of 3 lists of video nasties, as covered by Jake and Mark Morris on their excellent video packages, their DVD packages. We had the 39 films that were actually banned. There were other films that were looked at with a view to banning them, but then they were maybe allowed to be released in a cut form or shown in particular circumstances. And then there was a third list of the films that had been sort of considered and looked at and then dismissed and allowed through. So
I think on the third list, dealers were allowed the option to hand them in and concede it and avoid prosecution.
Yeah.
And that included stuff like John Carpenter's The Thing, Friday the 13th, Phantasm, Scanners.
So all films that we'd regard as being fairly mainstream and all that have been released to UK cinemas, because I've seen them all in UK cinemas.
Yeah, it's a remarkable list. I mean, like both Friday the 13th 1 and 2 are on that list. Rabid, Prom Night. Yeah. So this
Prom Night,
Prom Night,
unbelievable.
And these lists have actually distorted a lot of people's views about what is and isn't a video nasty, because a lot of titles often get mentioned as, that was banned, or
People
that was on the video nasty list.
The definitive.
And when you actually look at the list, there are a few surprises on there.
Night of the Living Dead was a Section 3 title.
Night of the Living Dead. It's just crazy. One of the things looking at, because I'm a horror fan, as people know. I do like horror films, but I was never that guy who was obsessed by seeing the uncut versions of things. I figured if a film's lost 3 minutes or 2 minutes or 30 seconds, I'm still getting the overall picture. As long as I'm not seeing 30% of the frame, I'm still getting the movie that was intended. But a lot of other fans don't feel that way, and I think maybe this is part of that kind of culture of is it uncut?
Yeah. Do you think, John, we were actually educated by VHS in that sense? Because when the first video stores opened up, the rental stores in the UK, we didn't know what we were getting. As you say, we'd read about some of these titles,
mythical titles, some of them, and then stuff we didn't even. What is that? Yeah.
And then when you finally got your hands on them and were able to rent them, A, it was magic. B, you took them home and played them, as I say, often in front of your parents or your auntie or your granny or whatever. But we didn't actually know that the films were cut or uncut. We didn't really know what we were getting.
We were learning it as we went.
And it was gradually through the circuit and through talking to other people and through the explosion of the fanzine, where people were suddenly writing letters in and getting each other's addresses and writing to each other and so on.
And this was all pre-internet.
Yeah. Word began coming out that, do you realise that film, that version of the film, is actually missing 15 seconds or missing a minute? Oh no, I didn't know. And I think it was that network that sort of created all of this.
And there wasn't compulsion to see it. There was forbidden fruits.
Yeah.
As if somebody says you can't see this, obviously as a autonomous adult, you're going to say, fuck you, I'm going to try and see it now. But and it's a very male thing, isn't it? It's like it goes back to us allegedly being hunters in prehistoric times. You want to get the whole thing. You want to get the whole mammoth and eat every bit of meat on it. You want to bring it home to your family. You want to see. You want to see everything.
It's a stupidly violent version of Pokemon. Then you've got to catch them all.
Yeah, it's completism.
Yeah. Completism, yeah. I mean, I as I say, I was 6 when it happened, so a lot of these films were being released on DVD when I was 21, 22, something like that. So I got to see them uncut, or as near as damn it, I guess, when they came out on DVD. But my only real outrage that made me feel like, actually, no, I am actually upset these things are being cut, was less to do with the video cuts and more to do with TV, cut for TV. So like, I had a version of Lethal Weapon that I watched over and over again up until I was about 18, 19, something like that. I came to university, was working at a video shop. fancied seeing it again, took it home. That means like 20 minutes longer. The whole sequences in that were completely cut out of my version. So that's when I first realised that these films were being cut.
Yeah, and again, it's not just, we're talking about Video Nasties here, and they were sort of subject to a lot of censorship and oppression and so on. But this was applying to mainstream films. Lethal Weapon, you've just mentioned there, things like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Again, people were sort of watching these and finding out exactly the same thing that you did, Adam. They'd sort of watch them in a TV version, or they'd watch them in the cinema where they might have been cut, and then they'd buy them on VHS or Blu-ray or DVD or whatever format, and suddenly notice a scene or two that they'd never seen before. So, censorship isn't just for cult movie fans like us folks. It applies to you. It applies to the any mainstream fare that you might be watching. So be vigilant.
And bringing us bang up to date, I was watching Fawlty Towers on TV last night, and it was the Basil the Rat episode. And there's one scene where he's in a conversation with the Major, and it's so obviously cut. And the Major's probably saying something racist, but very, very awkwardly, abruptly cut.
Yeah, I think Fawlty Towers has had a few issues recently, and
but again, you're not supposed to be right on. The Major's talking the truth like it is, man. You're supposed to be seeing what a fool he is.
Yeah, he's a racist. He's written as a racist character,
he's
and he's
from
of that
dementia,
particular generation.
Yeah.
We're all sort of involved in film criticism and in film analysis, but we've also sort of dabbled in fiction here and there, and as with my sort of fiction writer hat on, the next thing that I don't want to be oppressed is I want to be able to write characters that have got extreme views, and that seems as though it could be the next area that is going to be subject to censorship. And there's a lot of misunderstanding there. Just because I write a racist character, I'm not writing from my own point of view. And I think artists are going to have to defend that. And I think there are some artists who don't want to defend it. I think the battle lines are already being drawn there. And it's in the way that it was difficult to defend a Joe D'Amato or Jess Franco movie or a cannibal movie. It's going to be difficult to defending depictions of racism or sexism or whatever otherism you want to put into your work. And I think some artists are going to back away from that, which is a shame, and some are going to go for it. And I think we're going to see a new battleground there.
Fascinating. Cool. Well, I think we've pretty much covered. I was about to say we've pretty much covered all there is to say about Video Nasties, but as is seen by any number of books being released, documentaries being made, TV style, there's always more to talk about with Video Nasties. But I think we're probably done for today. Just finally on the point of capitalising on the Video Nasties, it's not just the big companies. Even us here at Quad capitalised on censorship by screening Alex Cox's TV version of Repo Man, the one which infamously brought the term melon farmer into wider popular culture. So even we're not above making money off these movies. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to thank the BFI and the Quad for supporting these podcasts. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks' time. Take care.